want to tell you the story about a man named Jacob in the Bible. Jacob, one of the early patriarchs of the Bible, was a man who wrestled with God. Actually, the name Jacob means the one who grasps the heel, which was kind of an idiom for a deceiver, a sneaky person, a trickster of sorts. He was at a river, kind of like the one behind us, and Jacob crossed the river, leaving all of his family, all of his kids, all of his goods on the other side of that river. And that night, a man met with him and wrestled with him. And this is the ultimate wrestling match. They didn't just wrestle for 10 minutes, they wrestled throughout the night. This is MMA meets Greco-Roman wrestling meets Navy SEALs training. I mean, this is an 8-hour long wrestling match where Jacob has no energy left. And as he wrestles throughout the night, he's still unwilling to give up, still unwilling to give in to this man. And when the man finally realizes, as the dawn is approaching, that Jacob won't give up in this wrestling match, he finally ends the match by reaching out and touching Jacob's hip. When he does so, he cripples Jacob for life. Jacob walks with a limp for the rest of his life. The man is ultimately showing who's truly in charge. But here's how the wrestling match comes to an end. Jacob finally realizes that this man is not just some guy, and he says to him, "I want you to bless me." He knows that he's come in contact with God. And the man asks Jacob a very important question. He says to Jacob, "What is your name?" And Jacob says, "My name is Jacob." And the man renames Jacob Israel, which means the one who wrestles with God. And God's people from that point forward are forever renamed Israel. And really, this becomes sort of a parable for Jacob. His whole life, he's been wrestling with God. He's been wrestling with God theologically. Who is God? Is God the sovereign God, the one and only God of all the nations? Does God actually care about Jacob? Is he actually involved in his life? Jacob went through a number of difficult times of different suffering throughout his life. And perhaps that's been true of you. Maybe you're someone who has been wrestling with God. You're wrestling with whether there is a God. You're wrestling with who God is and what he is doing in your life. Maybe you're wrestling with what he wants for you specifically. What is his will? Or you're wrestling with why he's allowed so much difficulty and hardship and suffering in your life. You see, friends, wrestling with God doesn't mean necessarily that you don't believe in him. Wrestling with God means you're not apathetic in your faith, that you're struggling. You want to know God more. In fact, if we're not wrestling with God, I wonder if we're becoming a little too comfortable with who God is and what God is doing. In the New Testament, we see the ultimate wrestling match. And that's in Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus wrestles also through the night with what God, he knows God the Father has called him to do. That God has called him to the cross. And on the cross, he would bear the wrath of God. He would bear our sin. And as Jesus wrestles with the weight of this responsibility, he begins to sweat and pray and cry out to God because Christ goes to the cross and dies in our place. I just want to encourage you, if maybe you're at a point right now where you're wrestling with God, you're struggling with the very nature of God or what God is doing in your life, just know with confidence that even when all is stripped away, God loves us, he cares about us, he names us, that we belong